It was 3 a.m. when I heard the first scream echo across the cul-de-sac like a dying animal. I jolted upright, heart racing, rain hammering my windows in rhythmic fury. A siren blared outside, and I stumbled to the front window, still half asleep. What I saw stopped me cold. Water, an entire wall of it, was rushing down the slope behind the HOA clubhouse like a liquefied freight train. Firefighters were already on site, wading waist-deep through the parking lot, yelling over the roaring storm. A folding table slammed against a window and shattered it. Someone's yoga mat floated by like a lost raft in a flood zone. And there, soaked to the bone and waving her arms like a malfunctioning windmill, was Karen, our newly minted HOA president, screaming into a walkie-talkie as water poured into the clubhouse she'd just had renovated. And I thought to myself, I warned them. I told them exactly this would happen. But they capped my drainage pipe anyway. And now nature was filing a lawsuit with no intention of settling. 2 months earlier, I had been living peacefully in my modest home at the end of a private lot in our HOA community. My backyard sloped gently into a wooded creek that served as a natural drainage route for runoff coming down from the hill above. Years ago, I had paid out of pocket to install a professionally engineered storm pipe, with full city permits, to ensure my property didn't become a swamp every time it rained. It wasn't flashy. It was a simple black pipe about 10 inches in diameter with a rock-lined outflow. It did its job perfectly, quietly redirecting thousands of gallons of runoff down to the creek and keeping everything dry and stable. That pipe was my unsung hero. Then Karen got elected. Karen didn't just want to be HOA president. She wanted to be queen. On her first day in office, she emailed the entire neighborhood an announcement titled "A New Era of Aesthetics and Order." I should have known then I was in trouble. She and her hand-picked team started nitpicking everything from mailbox paint colors to how high sunflowers were allowed to grow. It was annoying but harmless at first. But then, during a walk-through inspection, Karen spotted the storm pipe and called it an eyesore. She emailed me a photo of it circled in red and wrote, "This pipe violates our aesthetic harmony and presents a potential hazard. Please remove it immediately." I replied politely. I sent her copies of the city permits, the engineering drawings, and even photos from the original installation with a city inspector signing off on it. I offered to walk her through how it functioned and why removing it would be dangerous. She didn't reply. 2 days later, I found yellow tape wrapped around the pipe and a notice of non-compliance zip-tied to a bush. Karen had convened a snap vote with her 3-person aesthetic subcommittee and declared the pipe both ugly and illegal. She gave me 10 days to remove it or face fines. I went to the next HOA board meeting. I brought a flash drive full of documentation, including emails from the city confirming the pipe was fully compliant and necessary. I explained the slope behind the clubhouse channeled most of the rainwater through my property, and blocking the pipe could cause serious flooding. Karen sat back in her chair with a smug expression and said, "Maybe you should have considered that before ruining the natural look of the landscape." One of the board members, clearly just echoing her, chimed in saying nature always finds a balance. I wanted to scream. Instead, I calmly said, "If you cap that pipe, it's not going to find balance. It's going to find the lowest point on the slope. And that's your clubhouse." I thought I'd made my point. But a week later, while I was at work, Karen sent a landscaping crew to my property. They didn't even knock. They dug out the pipe's mouth and poured quickset concrete into it. When I got home and saw the gray lump sealing off the outflow, I was furious. I confronted the crew, but they just shrugged and said they had orders from the HOA. I took pictures, called the city, filed complaints, but by the time red tape started moving, the rainy season was already on the horizon. Karen refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. She emailed me saying all drainage infrastructure must be HOA approved and compatible with our visual standard. Any unauthorized modification to common land aesthetics will be penalized. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. She treated water runoff like it was a cosmetic issue, not a force of nature. The other residents didn't understand what had happened. Some didn't even know about the pipe. A few asked why their backyards were getting soft or why there was more water pooling near the clubhouse. Karen brushed them off, blaming sprinkler misuse. She even claimed the ground was just adjusting to new landscaping efforts. Meanwhile, I was silently watching the storm clouds build, knowing exactly what was about to come. I installed a monitoring system in my backyard. I rigged up a basic water level sensor using parts from a home automation kit and wired it to my phone. Every time the water reached a certain level, it pinged me. I also put in a wildlife camera to record any movement around the slope, in case something dramatic happened. I didn't have to wait long. The forecast predicted a major storm. Not drizzle. Not summer sprinkles. A real thunder-thrashing, windshield wiper-snapping monster of a downpour. I emailed Karen and the HOA board one last time, attached every file, begged them to remove the cap. No one responded. 2 days later, the rain came, and so did karma. Now, standing by the window watching the entire clubhouse parking lot transform into a shallow lake, I realized the water wasn't just pooling. It was moving. Fast. The hill runoff, now with no outlet, was sliding across saturated ground like oil on glass. And it was dragging mud, stones, and shrub roots along with it. Everything that should have gone through the pipe was now redirecting straight toward the back wall of the HOA's newly renovated clubhouse. I saw a large decorative flower pot get swept away, slam into a door, and knock it open. Water gushed inside. I got dressed, put on my boots, and stepped outside, where the fire department was already assessing the damage. I didn't say anything to Karen as she stood flailing beside a drenched news reporter. I didn't need to. The look of pure disbelief on her face said everything. She had treated my warning like an inconvenience. Now she was knee-deep in the consequences. Literally. The next morning brought a heavy stillness to the neighborhood. The storm had passed, but it left behind a trail of soggy ruins and stunned residents trying to make sense of what had happened. I stepped outside to the sound of boots squelching through mud, hoses blasting silt off driveways, and distant arguments echoing from the HOA clubhouse. Yellow caution tape flapped in the breeze, half submerged in the remaining water that still pooled around the lot. The clubhouse lawn looked like a battlefield, torn up and pockmarked with sludge and debris. It was surreal watching neighbors who had once sided with Karen now standing in front of her with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. My phone buzzed with a notification from my camera feed. Overnight, it had captured the full cascade from the blocked slope all the way to the clubhouse. The footage was astonishing. It showed the rain falling in sheets, water pooling higher and higher, until it finally overflowed the ridge and crashed down like a waterfall made of mud and broken landscaping. I uploaded the video to a cloud link and sent it to the city inspector who had helped me with my original permit. I also copied it to the HOA board with a short message. In case you were wondering where the water came from. I hit send and went to refill my coffee, hearing a neighbor shout in the distance something about their car floating a few feet from where they parked it. Karen had gone unusually quiet. The day before, she had screamed and demanded emergency plumbers, then accused me of sabotage when the city workers arrived. But now, it seemed like the weight of what happened had finally cracked through her armor. She wasn't striding around anymore. She was lurking in the background, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast skies, and avoiding the reporters who still lingered around the taped-off area. The local news vans had arrived just before dawn, tipped off by someone on Nextdoor who uploaded a blurry photo of the clubhouse turning into a water feature. The headline on the morning broadcast read HOA Storm Drain Debacle and featured side-by-side clips of Karen proudly opening the remodeled clubhouse 2 weeks ago and the current footage of furniture being pulled out of the mud. I walked down to the end of the cul-de-sac where the city officials had set up a temporary tent to coordinate inspections. One of them, a man named Richard, recognized me from our previous correspondence. He shook his head as he reviewed the footage I sent him. "It's exactly like you said. The pipe was capped without permission, and the slope had no secondary drainage. Everything that hit that hill had nowhere to go but straight toward the clubhouse. He said they would be issuing a formal citation against the HOA for unauthorized interference with municipal drainage and endangering community property. When I asked what that meant, he said fines, penalties, and mandatory restoration. I thanked him, but it felt like a hollow victory. The damage had already been done. As I returned home, I passed by Donna, Karen's closest ally on the board. She stood outside her house with a mop and a dazed look, staring at the clubhouse with her hands on her hip. I gave a nod of acknowledgement. She didn't return it. Further down the block, a couple was arguing over who approved the blockage of the pipe. It became clear that most board members hadn't even known it had been capped. Karen had made the call, citing executive aesthetic authority. Now, they were scrambling to distance themselves from her as public backlash spread like wildfire. Later that afternoon, the HOA sent out a rushed community update. It was 4 paragraphs of vague language, mentioning an unexpected drainage event, and promising to review all landscaping decisions made during recent months. There was no mention of the pipe, no apology, just a thin attempt at damage control. Attached to the email was a survey link asking residents if they thought the clubhouse could be restored in time for the winter event. The comments section erupted with sarcasm. Someone responded with "maybe install a wave pool while you're at it." That evening, I was pulling trash bags of wet leaves and runoff from my backyard when a teenager from 2 streets over came by holding a drone controller. He said he'd gotten amazing footage from the air and asked if I wanted to see. The drone footage was brutal. It showed the slope, swollen with water, pouring over the ridge and washing out the entire lawn behind the clubhouse like a broken dam. In slow motion, you could see Karen standing near the main door, yelling at a maintenance worker while ankle-deep water flowed around her feet. The kid offered to send me the footage, and I thanked him. With permission, I uploaded a clip of it with timestamps and tagged the HOA's public email in the description. It went viral within hours. The next day, someone spray-painted on a temporary sign near the clubhouse entrance. It read "Flood Zone courtesy of Karen." It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't well received by Karen. She had it removed within an hour, but not before dozens of neighbors took photos and shared them in our group chat. I began noticing a shift. People who had once blindly followed the HOA rules started speaking up. They questioned the board. They demanded transparency. They asked why one person had been allowed to make a decision that affected the entire neighborhood. Meanwhile, Karen attempted damage control in the worst possible way. She called for a healing circle meeting in the rec room of the very same clubhouse that had been declared structurally unsafe. When told she couldn't use the space due to electrical hazards, she claimed the city was exaggerating the damage. When the city posted official warning notices on the clubhouse doors, she tried to tear one down and was caught by a neighbor who had just started filming her for fun. That video ended up on Reddit and was quickly picked up by a local comedy channel that added cartoonish sound effects and turned it into a parody skit. I stayed mostly quiet during all of this. I had said my piece. The pipe had been capped against my warnings, and nature had responded. Now the neighborhood had to face the consequences. But the anger in the community was growing, and so was the demand for accountability. By the end of the week, a group of residents had circulated a petition to hold a special meeting to review HOA leadership and investigate the pipe decision. The number of signatures doubled in 2 days. Karen tried to push back, claiming it was all being blown out of proportion by what she called drainage hysteria. But no one was listening anymore. They had seen the mud in their yards. They had waded through the water. They had heard her dismiss the danger. And now, her power was slipping through her fingers like the very water she had tried to control. By the time the weekend rolled around, the clubhouse resembled something between a disaster site and a poorly managed swamp. The smell hit you before you even saw the damage up close. musty, sour, and laced with something chemical that came from the soggy cleaning products abandoned mid-effort. A huge industrial fan sat outside, blowing air uselessly over wet carpet fragments and broken patio furniture. The HOA board had promised to bring in professionals, but all that showed up was one guy with a wet vac and a leaf blower. He gave up halfway through and left. Residents stood around shaking their heads, some filming, others just taking photos, all while avoiding Karen's glare as she patrolled the lot like she could command the water back underground if she scowled hard enough. Inside the building, city inspectors were doing their rounds, and the results were devastating. The electrical system was compromised. The flooring had warped and buckled. The drywall was soaked from the floor up to 2 feet, and mold was already starting to grow. One inspector stated clearly in a report overheard by half the neighborhood that the flooding was not only preventable but worsened by improper obstruction of a functioning drainage route. Karen tried to dispute this, talking over the inspector, saying the pipe was unapproved and that I had altered the flow of water without HOA consent. But the inspector held up a document, turned it toward her, and calmly said, it was city-approved, 5 years ago, with signatures from 2 municipal engineers. Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. She didn't say a word for the next 5 minutes. By noon, local news vans were back. Apparently, the footage from the previous day had picked up enough traction online that bigger media outlets were circling in. A reporter stood on the front lawn as she recapped the timeline, calling it a bizarre case of HOA interference gone wildly wrong. Behind her, in the middle of her piece, a folding chair floated by in a foot of standing water, prompting her cameraman to zoom in and add another layer of irony to the unfolding drama. Karen tried to intercept the crew but was told by city officials that the property was now under assessment and she was not allowed to interfere with documentation efforts. I received a call around 2 in the afternoon. It was from an older neighbor named Marlene, who lived on the far side of the community and had never once come to a board meeting. She sounded shaken. She wanted to apologize. She said she had voted for Karen in the last election because Karen seemed organized, but now she felt like she'd been sold a brochure with a smiling face covering pure chaos. I thanked her for the call and told her not to worry. People were realizing the truth now. She wasn't the only one. Over the next 24 hours, I received 7 more messages like that. Some were from residents who had supported the drainage pipes removal. Others were board members themselves. One even said Karen told them I had installed the pipe to water my own garden faster and had made up the story about the city permit. That lie unraveled quickly once the documents became public record. Meanwhile, Karen was growing more unhinged. She organized a small gathering at the community playground and tried to stage a press event, claiming she had a statement to make. Only 4 people showed up, and 2 of them were kids on bike. She stood in front of the swing set, clutching a clipboard and shouting over wind gusts that she had been sabotaged, framed, and digitally harassed. One of the kids laughed. The video of that rant made it to TikTok under the tag Swampgate and was viewed over 100,000 times in a single day. The residents weren't just angry, they were mobilizing. An emergency meeting was announced, not by the HOA board, but by the community itself. Legally, if 1/3 of the homeowners signed a petition, a special vote could be triggered. By the time the forms reached my mailbox, the sheets were already filled with names, more than half the neighborhood accounted for. The topic of the meeting was direct and brutal. Removal of Karen from the HOA board and investigation into abuse of authority regarding community infrastructure. Karen tried to play the victim. She sent an email blast late that night claiming she had been cyberbullied, her reputation destroyed by edited videos, and that I was behind a campaign of targeted harassment. She even claimed I had hacked the sprinkler system to make the slope look wetter than it was. It was pure desperation. No one bought it. The city engineer's report had already confirmed the facts, and my videos had timestamps, location data, and audio that backed everything up. Besides, it was hard to argue against footage showing a literal geyser of stormwater raging down the hill where a pipe used to be. During the special meeting, held at a local library since the clubhouse was still unsafe, the community packed the room. Over 70 residents showed up, some standing in the back, others sitting on the floor. Karen came in late and tried to take her usual seat at the front, only to be asked to sit with the rest of the attendees. That moment alone sparked an awkward silence that turned into a wave of whispered amusement. One by one, residents stood and spoke. They told stories of flooded backyards, of sudden sinkholes forming where the water had shifted the soil, of damage to fences, gardens, and even one resident's basement. I was asked to present the timeline and evidence. I didn't gloat. I just showed them what happened, step by step. The capped pipe, the diverted water, the warning emails, the footage, and the flood. When the vote was finally held, it wasn't close. Out of 72 ballots, 68 voted to remove Karen. 2 abstained. 1 voted no. And 1 ballot just had the words "Fix the pipe" written in big red marker. Karen stormed out before the tally was complete. She tripped over someone's backpack on the way out and let out a frustrated grunt that echoed as the door closed behind her. Nobody laughed, but you could feel it. It was in the air, that mix of justice and relief. Outside, the rain had started again, light and steady. I walked home slowly, the air cool and fresh, the sky gray but no longer threatening. I passed the slope behind my house and saw the runoff already beginning to build. The capped pipe was still there, a monument to bad decisions, but the city had approved its restoration and scheduled work to begin the next day. This time, there would be no interference. Karen's reign had ended, not with a dramatic speech or a grand confrontation, but with soaked shoes, silent ballots, and a neighborhood that had finally opened its eyes. The morning after the vote, the neighborhood felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in weeks, no one was arguing in the group chat. No warning letters were slipped into mailboxes. No emails came from Karen's HOA account, which had finally been disabled after the board's emergency decision. It was almost eerie walking past the clubhouse without hearing her voice echo from inside or seeing her SUV parked in the loading zone like she owned the pavement. The building itself still looked like a flooded relic from a bad weather documentary, but somehow it felt lighter just knowing she no longer had her grip on the community. I was outside with a contractor from the city drainage department, standing over the old concrete cap that had sealed off my pipe. It looked almost symbolic now, like a tombstone for common sense. The contractor whistled and shook his head. He said he'd never seen a homeowner get the city, the HOA, and half the internet to agree on anything this fast. I told him I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the water to flow where it was supposed to. He laughed and said, "Well, after this we might name the drainage system after you." I watched as his team began breaking through the cap, chunk by chunk, revealing the pipe mouth again. It felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. Meanwhile, the HOA board was scrambling to distance itself from Karen's decisions. Donna, the vice president and Karen's closest ally, resigned the morning after the vote. She left a one-sentence message saying she needed time to reflect. Some residents said she had packed up and gone to stay with relatives out of town. Others claimed she'd been advised by a lawyer to disappear before the investigation started. Either way, she was gone, and no one seemed in a hurry to ask when she'd be back. A temporary leadership committee was formed, and for the first time in a long while, it actually included a few residents who didn't just nod along with everything. The investigation began that same week. The city's legal department opened a formal review of the HOA's decisions surrounding the blocked drainage. They requested copies of all communications between Karen, the landscaping company that did the capping, and any contractors involved. That's when things got really interesting. It turned out Karen hadn't just acted on her own, she'd pressured the landscaping company by threatening to blacklist them from all future HOA work if they didn't comply immediately. She told them it was a beautification project approved unanimously. But when the company asked for paperwork, She sent a one-page memo she wrote herself, with no official city stamp or engineer's review. They followed through out of fear of losing future contracts. When this came to light, the city's tone changed. What began as a code violation turned into a potential civil liability. I received a letter informing me that I was entitled to file a property damage claim, not only with the HOA's insurance but directly with Karen as an individual if I chose to. I hesitated at first. I wasn't interested in dragging her through court, but then I remembered the smug way she dismissed every warning I gave her. The way she told me nature always adapts. The way she turned something as serious as storm safety into a personal crusade against aesthetic. So I filed the claim. I documented the flooded section of my yard, the minor erosion near the slope, and the landscaping costs I had to pay when everything got waterlogged. It wasn't about money. It was about principle. As news of the investigation spread, more stories surfaced. Turns out Karen had been quietly approving other changes to the neighborhood without proper procedures. One resident came forward saying Karen had ordered their rose bushes removed because they clashed with the neighborhood's theme, even though there was no such clause in the bylaws. Another claimed Karen denied a wheelchair ramp request, citing it as an eyesore. The more people dug, the worse it got. She had essentially run the HOA like a dictatorship wrapped in floral print and fake charm. Then came the insurance bombshell. The HOA's insurer, after reviewing the situation, sent a formal notice that their policy was being reviewed for breach of contract. They cited gross negligence and unauthorized alterations to infrastructure as possible grounds for denial of coverage. That meant the entire cost of the clubhouse flood, repairs, cleanup, structural reinforcement, might fall directly on the HOA and, by extension, the resident. Panic set in. Emergency meetings were called. The board scrambled to prove that Karen had acted alone and that the rest of them were unaware. But emails surfaced showing at least 2 board members had expressed concerns and were told to stay out of it by Karen. That implication was enough to trigger resignations. Within a week, the entire HOA leadership had either stepped down or been suspended pending further review. At the next community gathering, held at a nearby fire station since the clubhouse was still a wreck, the mood had changed completely. People were no longer whispering in frustration. They were openly calling for reform. A new board election was scheduled. Candidates stood up and spoke about transparency, common sense, and respect for the people who actually lived here. I didn't run for anything. I didn't want to. But when I was asked to help oversee the vote count, I agreed. It felt like a full-circle moment, like the neighborhood had finally come together not through rules or regulations, but through shared experience. Through mud and rain and one epic act of poor judgment that no one would ever forget. Karen, on the other hand, had vanished from public life. Her house sat dark most days. The blinds were always drawn. A for sale sign appeared one morning, small and understated, just stuck in the corner of her lawn like it was afraid to be seen. Rumor had it she'd moved in with a cousin in another state, hoping to avoid further embarrassment. But people had long memories, and the internet didn't forget. Her meltdown video, complete with the flying chair and the swing set rant, had made its way to a national morning show. They played a clip while laughing at HOA horror stories, and Karen's name had become a symbol of what happens when power goes unchecked and common sense gets drowned in rainwater. The final approval for my pipe restoration came through just as spring began. I walked down to the end of the slope and stood beside the now fully open pipe, listening to the gentle sound of runoff flowing exactly where it was supposed to. It was quiet, peaceful. Everything had come full circle. The water was flowing. The HOA was rebuilding. And the nightmare that started with one bad decision was finally washing away. But not forgotten. Not by a long shot. Spring came in gently, bringing with it a stretch of calm days and soft breezes that almost made the neighborhood forget what it had endured. The flowers returned, the grass healed over the gouges from the flood, and the laughter of kids playing outside replaced the distant hum of news vans and angry phone calls. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The HOA, once feared like an iron-fisted monarch with a clipboard, now operated more like a town hall, open, transparent, and cautiously humble. The new board, made up of actual volunteers from the community rather than Karen's hand-picked loyalists, held their first meeting on folding chairs in someone's driveway. No one complained. In fact, more people showed up than ever before. The clubhouse, still scarred by the flood, had finally begun repairs after the HOA insurance miraculously decided to cover partial costs, likely hoping to avoid being dragged into the public scandal any further. However, the deductible was monstrous, and the neighborhood had to chip in through a one-time assessment. It wasn't ideal, but there were no protests. Everyone understood who had caused the problem. There were no illusions about that anymore. The signs on the clubhouse doors, still showing faded waterlines like bruises, were left untouched as a reminder. A few people even joked they should put up a plaque above it saying "Never block the flow." I stayed mostly in the background during this time, happy to focus on my own property, watching the restored drainage system do its job during occasional light rains. It was like therapy, watching the water travel the correct path again, flowing down the slope and disappearing neatly into the creek like it had always been meant to. The pipe, once seen as an eyesore by the wrong people, had become a kind of legend around the neighborhood. I'd overhear parents explaining to their kids how it worked. Teenagers nicknamed it the floodgate. Someone even stuck a little toy boat near the outflow as a joke. I didn't remove it. In a weird way, it fit. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a voicemail, a real, stamped, signed letter. It was from the city attorney's office. The investigation into Karen's actions had concluded. While she wasn't being criminally charged, the report confirmed she had acted with gross negligence and manipulated board authority to push unauthorized changes. She had been barred from holding any official position in a registered HOA for the next 10 years and fined individually for violating city drainage code. That fine didn't come close to covering the damages, but it was something. It was acknowledgement, and it meant her days of ruling over people with a garden hat and a measuring tape were over. The neighborhood's sentiment toward me had shifted as well. Where once I had been just another homeowner who kept to himself, now people nodded when I walked by. Some waved. A few even stopped to ask advice on landscaping, especially anything involving water management. I helped where I could. I didn't do it for recognition, but I wasn't going to lie, it felt good. Not in a revenge way. In a relief way. Like people finally realized the cost of ignoring facts in favor of appearances. Then one day, something unexpected happened. The new HOA president, a retired architect named Leo who had lived quietly at the far end of the community for years, showed up at my door with a strange smile and a large cardboard box. He handed it to me without saying a word and then motioned for me to open it. Inside were 3 things. A city-approved plaque engraved with my name and the words "in appreciation for safeguarding our homes," a t-shirt that said Team Drainage in large blue letters, and a small silver pipe-shaped trophy. I laughed harder than I had in months. Leo shrugged and said we figured you earned it, whether you wanted it or not. I invited him in, and we spent the afternoon talking about how to make the HOA less of a nuisance and more of a partnership. It was the kind of conversation I never thought I'd have with anyone on the board. News of the flood and Karen's downfall eventually faded from the broader internet, replaced by new scandals and trending hashtags. But within our little neighborhood, it became a cautionary tale that never quite went away. New residents heard it during welcome committee visits. Longtime homeowners referenced it when proposing rule changes. And every time someone suggested a major alteration to shared property, someone else would inevitably ask, "Is this going to be another pipe situation?" Karen's house sold after months of sitting empty. The listing made no mention of her former role or the history attached to the address, but everyone knew. The new owners, a young couple with a toddler and a rescue dog, moved in quietly. They kept to themselves at first, probably sensing some residual weirdness around the property. I made it a point to drop off a welcome basket and introduce myself. They were surprised when I mentioned I lived just down the hill. They'd heard something about the pipe story but didn't know the details. I told them the short version. They laughed nervously and said they hoped they didn't inherit any of the drama. I assured them they wouldn't, not unless they planned on capping anything that flowed. As time went on, the slope greened up again. Wildflowers returned along the creek's edge, and the once eroded hill began to stabilize thanks to new native plants installed as part of the restoration project. Kids played there now, rolling toy trucks through the shallow water during dry days. A few even built a little dam of their own using sticks and stones, only to watch it break and laugh when the water washed it away. I didn't stop them. It was how you learned, after all. In the end, the story wasn't about a pipe or a flood or even a disgraced HOA president. It was about what happens when someone values control over reason, and what can be saved when people finally stand up and say no. It was about weathering storms, literal and metaphorical, and coming out the other side with a little more wisdom, a little more humor, and a lot more appreciation for letting water, and people, flow the way they're meant to. And every time the skies darkened and the first drops of rain began to fall, I'd step out onto my porch, look toward the hill, and listen for the quiet rush of water sliding smoothly through the pipe, down the slope, past the clubhouse, and into the creek. No flooding, no chaos, just a sound as steady and calm as the neighborhood had finally become.